Lions for Lambs movie review. So this is part of my scripted movie review series in which I read off old movie reviews that I wrote years ago for the blog. I mention this particularly in this case because this movie came out in 2007 and I feel like it's been completely forgotten about since. Although I'm currently living abroad. I've been living abroad teaching English for a number of years now, so I'm a little bit out of touch, maybe. So I don't know, let me know if I'm wrong, but definitely my impression is that this movie has been completely forgotten. Which leads me to the obvious rhetorical question, does anyone even remember this movie? It was a big deal when it came out, at least as I remember it. It had lots of stars in the cast: Robert Redford, Tom Cruise, Meryl Streep. Those are the big headliners. Also Andrew Garfield, although it was before Andrew Garfield had become really famous, so nobody cared back then. And other people. I think the guy who was the supporting character in Ant-Man and Wasp, Michael Pena, I think his name is. Some other notable names in there as well. And it was a movie about, it was primarily a discussion about the American wars in the Middle East at the time, the ones in Iraq and Afghanistan, which I believe we are still involved with in some capacity, although it gets a little bit confusing, and I've stopped actively following it over the years. But anyways, this movie was when these wars were a lot more in the headlines than they are now. It was a discussion about the wars, and it did not do well. It got a number of bad reviews. I liked it well enough. I thought it was entertaining. But I think the thing is, the movie is primarily just one long discussion. Or rather, it's a whole series of separate discussions. But it's a very talky movie. Now, I didn't particularly mind this. I've always been a political geek, one of those people who kind of stayed up late in college debating politics in the dorm rooms, or, somebody who likes watching PBS NewsHour or something like that. So to me, I didn't really mind that the whole movie was people talking about politics. But I think part of the problem was this was a wide release movie, and certainly not everyone likes the same things I do. So, you can imagine if someone's expecting the next, American Pie movie or Fast and the Furious movie, and they have to sit through this, particularly if they're a movie critic, and if they have to sit through this because it's their job. Yeah, I can see where there would be some bad reactions to that. Also, I saw this as a rental. And I think your investment in a movie is a lot different when you rent it than when you go through the trouble of driving through the movie theater. I mean, can you imagine going through all the hype of going out to the movies, it's a night in the movies, let's all go together, get the tickets, get the popcorn, get the soda, and you're all sitting there, and then people are just talking for 2 hours. I can imagine this did not work quite as well in the cinema. I thought it was perfectly fine. For a rental. I largely enjoyed the conversations. One thing that this movie had gotten criticized for by the critics, and perhaps rightly so, is there was absolutely nothing new in it. It didn't bring anything to the table that hadn't been said a million times before in other op-eds or other discussions or cable news or whatever. That's somewhat inevitable, especially when you consider a movie, news is nightly. But a movie has this whole production process where it takes a couple of years from the moment it's first proposed to the moment it hits the theaters, which kind of hampers its ability to say kind of anything mind-blowing or anything, by the time they start shooting the movie, it's already dated in a sense. Which is arguably possibly why Hollywood avoids these hugely topical movies. Although Hollywood likes to avoid these hugely topical movies anyways because they tend to be a little bit sensitive. And the goal of a movie is to have as broad-based appeal as possible. which makes this kind of a unique movie that this came out, and that this had, you know, this was a mainstream release with all these stars and presumably a budget that could cover the salaries of these stars, although I don't know what the budgeting process was for this movie. And it's also quite a big change because, to the best of my knowledge, somebody correct me if I'm getting this wrong, but, you know, the Vietnam War, right? Everyone thinks about the Vietnam War and the massive anti-war protests and the anti-war sentiment. I don't think there was any mainstream Hollywood movie that was anti-Vietnam War, at least not explicitly discussing it the way they're discussing the Iraq and Afghanistan wars in this movies. And this, again, came out in 2007, so it was still topical when it came out. I mean, the only Hollywood movie I can think of is The Green Berets with John Wayne. If you haven't seen that movie, that's a trip, but that's a whole different subject for another video. But, yeah, that movie was explicitly a pro-war movie. I can't think of, you know, like I can think of movies that had anti-war themes or anti-war sentiments that came out in the 60s, but I can't think of any movie that was explicitly talking about the problem in Vietnam the way this movie was explicitly talking about the problems in Iraq and Afghanistan. So it's a sign that things have changed, maybe, or I don't know. Or that things had changed at that moment in time when this came out. That being said, it's not the greatest movie. Some of the things that the critics have said against it are legitimate. I mean, if you wanted to take this apart with a red pen, you could. So the whole movie, almost the whole movie, is people sitting around talking. And there are so many times when one character makes a good point that there's an easy rebuttal to it, but the other character misses the easy rebuttal. Or when one character says something that's not logical and another character doesn't pick them up on it. There are so many holes in the arguments being presented. Also, for a movie that's entirely people sitting around talking, the screenwriter seems to have had a remarkably poor ear for how people actually talk in real conversation, like in real life. There were several times in the movie when I thought to myself, oh, come on, nobody talks like that in real life. I think the most glaring example is the classroom discussion scenes. The one where Andrew Garfield as a student is piping up and talking in the class. But there was a lot of close seconds. The dialogue between Robert Redford and his slacker student, Meryl Streep singing The Who to her editor, that just struck me as something that would never happen in real life. Of course, it's the movies, right? So, to a certain extent, maybe you don't go to this to see a real-life facsimile of conversation. I mean, in real life, everyone's always stuttering over their sentences and making incomplete thoughts and stuff like that, and saying, you know, needless filler things like stuff like that. So, yeah, in that respect, maybe it's just as well. I mean, action sequences aren't realistic in a movie, so should we expect dialogue to be realistic? I don't know. I guess you don't expect a movie to be entirely realistic, but there were a few times where it was, I thought, so blatantly unrealistic that it pulled me out of the movie a bit. Now, the politics of this film are kind of a bland liberalism type of politics. The suffering of the people in the two countries that the U.S. Army is occupying, Iraq and Afghanistan, are not shown at all, not discussed at all, never mentioned or alluded to the extent that people are talking about the merits and demerits of the war, it's entirely in terms of the suffering of the U.S. Another flaw, arguably, in the movie, depending on your point of view, is that the good intentions of the U.S. government are assumed throughout. In other words, it's always assumed that the U.S. had humanitarian reasons for getting involved in Iraq and Afghanistan, but just that mistakes were made in the implementation of it. Noam Chomsky would not have agreed, but obviously Noam Chomsky was not one of the writers for this movie, so we get kind of a bland liberal opinion here. It's yeah. I mean, it's all right for what it is. It's people just sitting around and talking, and the dialogue is restricted to a very kind of centrist, liberal view of the problems with the war. But I found that entertaining for what that was. I mean, of course, I'm a political junkie, so I'm the kind of person who would. I mean, one final note, I guess. I'm not sure if this was a factor or not, but it is worth noting that any movie that has scenes involving U.S. soldiers or combat will get free support, I guess, meaning taxpayer funded, from the Pentagon if the Pentagon approves of the script. Which consequently means that I mean, no movies are actually censored for not showing the Pentagon in a positive light, but they don't get the free support either, which means it's advantageous for Hollywood to always show the Pentagon in a good light, and then for movies that don't show the Pentagon in a good light, it's harder for them to get the budget to shoot the war scenes. Which possibly could be why this movie is mostly people just sitting around talking. I mean, there are some military scenes in there, but it's a very small part of the movie, and you can see it's on a limited budget. That could well be the reason. So, yet another reason why you might want to cut this movie a little bit of slack, I guess. That is, if anyone still even remembers this movie or is still watching this movie, let me know if people are still watching this movie. My impression is it's been completely forgotten about nowadays.